year, and it's a really great pleasure for me to introduce Jason Wordie. Jason Wordie, I think, really needs no introduction, but please indulge me for a minute or two. He is, I think, as you know, widely known and a local historian and author. He has written several books, including Ruins of War, a guide to Hong Kong's battlefields and wartime sites, jointly written with Ko Tim Kung in 1996. He's written, The Voices of Macau Stones by Hong Kong U's former VC, Sir Lindsay and Lady Ride, the Illustrated General History of Macau, for which he prepared the manuscript and supplied additional material. Two items that I know are on sale here today, Streets Exploring Hong Kong Island, published in 2002, and its companion volume, Streets Exploring Hong Kong, which was published in 2007. I think you're also aware that Jason is a regular columnist for the South China Morning Post, and has been for many years. His current column, Then and Now, appears weekly in the Sunday Post magazine, and provides Jason with the opportunity to write vignettes about historical sites and events, which also allows him to draw on wider issues. For example, his attendance at Hong Kong U's Orientation Week activities 20 years ago. Yeah. Topic of one of his more recent columns, which had me intrigued and bemused. Jason also conducts historical walking tours in the region, including Hong Kong, Macau, and further afield in the Pearl River Delta region. And I noticed from his website that he has a walking tour tomorrow at 8:45, so we'll be finishing very promptly this evening. Of Kowloon City, so we won't keep him longer than we need to. So some other interesting facts about Jason: he's been a council member of the Royal Asiatic Society, he's a keen hiker and a gardener, he's served in the Royal Hong Kong Regiment, the Volunteers, from 1990 to 1992, and he's a history graduate of Hong Kong U.
But don't hold that against me.
No, we won't. In 2013, his latest book, Macau, People and Places, Past and Present, was published, and of course it is that book that is this evening's basis for discussion. So please join me in welcoming Jason.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for that kind invitation. I'm always a little bit dubious about microphones. Does this carry through to the back? You can hear okay? Right, good. Well, thank you very much again for that. Whenever I hear an introduction, I always feel a little bit vaguely embarrassed by it at the thought of, is that really me? But anyway, what I'm going to talk about this evening is my most recent book, which is that one, which is out in the foyer, and we bought 3 boxes, and I hope we sell them all by the end of today. Thank you. It was a joke. It was the only joke I'm going to tell in the course of the day. The themes I'm going to cover in the course of my talk this evening are the fun that I had in writing this book. Because the thing with this book, if you look at it, you'll notice it's rather a doorstop. I recommend anyone that purchases it in pairs, because it's useful for weightlifting purposes, maybe no other. But the thing with this is it really represented a culmination of what I tend to regard as 25 years reading and 6 years writing. And that was fairly much what it was, because the background and development and evolution of this book went on for quite a long time, and it was one of those projects which had several lives. The thing with this, which I feel I must explain at the very outset, is it was very heavily illustrated, and that actually was a connection with Hong Kong U, because my 2 earlier books, which are out there as well, or 2 of my earlier books out there, the photographs for those were done by Colin Day, who was the publisher at Hong Kong UP for a number of years, and also Professor Tony Headley, who was Professor of Community Medicine here. So when we were out exploring Hong Kong and exploring Kowloon, we took lots of photographs, and that was fun, and likewise Macau was a project which they were intimately involved with. So the photographs in this are Colin's and Tony's, and the artistry of it in that sense is theirs. So I think it's only fair and important to mention that. What I would like to talk about is some of the fun that went along with this and the personal journey of exploration that came with it, because Macau to me was a very, very personal place, and it still remains so. And writing a book about a very personal place is a clearly personal object. The cover illustration, which I'll then quickly go past on to, is something which to my mind encapsulates so much of Macau itself, because that's the Tin Hau Temple up at Haksar, toward the north of the city. And the thing with that particular Tin Hau Temple is it's very unvisited by tourists. And what I tended to aim toward in my book were things and places that people, the average visitor, would not necessarily see. But the thing that I liked with that, and that was one of Tony's pictures, is that it, to my mind, encapsulates much in Macau, and that you're kind of drawn in through this moon gate into a world that you don't necessarily expect that you're going to find. It's unusual and different, and you get taken in there. And of all of the photographs which we could have used for the cover, that was the one I wanted to use, because to my mind that best encapsulates Macau to me. But Macau itself, now let's hope this works. Like a great many people who go over to Macau, we go over looking and expecting for different things, and it's the same thing with any travel, because when we travel we go into ourselves as much as we go into another person, another place. And like a great many people who went to Macau, I went initially looking for something, and I wasn't quite sure what it was that I was looking for, and not entirely sure what it was that I would find. But so very many visitors today, and Macau is very, very heavily visited, particularly from Hong Kong, people go over looking for a good time. They go looking for a day out, and what do they come back with? Most come back with salsa of one kind or another. And this is the thing, because if you're on the ferry on a Sunday night, dozens of people have dozens of bags exactly the same. And that's the thing that I tend to find, because everyone goes expecting something, they come back with a little bit different to what they'd had, and that was one of the images I rather liked. It, to my mind, encapsulated the visitor experience. The very first night that I stayed in Macau, which was in 1988, I had the very good fortune to stay in the old Bella Vista, the Fungeng. Now, the thing with the Fungeng, for anyone who remembers it in the old days, as I'm fortunate enough, old enough now to do, it, to my mind, was so much what Macau was like then. It was old and grubby and left behind, and you turned on the water and the water came out brown and the walls were all grubby and so on. And it was one of those things where you looked at it and thought, this is magical. And I'm taken in and I'm beguiled, but I don't quite know why I'm liking this place where the water's brown. That was my very first night there, and I was entranced by it. And in the successive 6 years or so, I was working with the army up in the New Territories at that time. I used to go over to Macau as regularly as I could, and the idea with then is it was a different world, and it was something that at the time I didn't realise that I was making an investment in what would latterly be an enduring career and interest. I was exploring, and I didn't quite know why, but I was taking things in and getting a lot from it. So the Fungeng has always been a special place. It was subsequently taken over by the Mandarin Hotel, who tarted it up without a great deal of success, and then it was closed down, and now the Portuguese Consul General lives in it. And I had the great good fortune to go in there a few weeks ago, and that was actually very nice, because I looked and thought, yep, it hasn't changed too much. Lucky Consul General having that. The thing with Macau is there are a number of corners where if you know where you're looking, things haven't changed a great deal. Now, this is the Old Waterfront. Now, my very first night in Macau back then was spent wandering back and forth along the waterfront, then largely unchanged by reclamation, today very different. And whenever I'm over there and I've got a bit of time to myself, if you look in the right direction, and that's the thing with Macau, if your eye travels there rather than there, things haven't changed a great deal. It's too easy for people today to go over and look and say it's all new, it's all modern, there's all the casinos, it's all horrible, and not necessarily see that there's a lot there if you know what you're looking at. And the waterfront is still there too. Another building that struck me that first experience, and I've always liked looking at it, is this green one, and that's down on the waterfront. This one is a connection actually to Macau and Southeast Asia, because this one was owned by the Federation Malaya, and this building was used as the Malayan cadets' mess, because from the 1920s onwards the Federation sent up police cadets and administrative cadets to Macau to learn Cantonese. And the reason they sent them to Macau is, unlike sending them to Hong Kong, it didn't have the distraction of the European social community here, which might get in their way. So that was the Malayan cadets mess. Who owns it now, I'm not quite sure. It's always been kept in an extremely good state of repair, so it wouldn't surprise me greatly if it was still Federation owned. It's largely unoccupied and you never really see anyone there except a bit of sweeping. But I always look at that and like it, and it reminds me too of a poem which I quoted at length in my book. And this was from one of the Malayan cadets, a chap called Gerald Jolly, who was up as a language student in Macau from 1948 to 50. And he wrote this lengthy poem when he went, but just as he was leaving, on how beautiful Macau was and how much he liked it and so on. And so many of the people who spent their time there were very, very beguiled by it. And I was particularly moved by this poem because he expressed within it a wish that he'd be able to come back at some point. But he didn't, because almost as soon as he got back to Malaya, he was killed in the emergency and was buried in Batu Gajah. So it's one of those connections with a time and a place. I mentioned this image of the moon gate. The cover has been slightly chemically altered. If you go over there today, you'll find it is yellow rather than green, but I wanted green on the cover, so I had what I wanted. But the thing that I like with this, as well as being the temple, is it brings in Macau's regionality, because the thing with Macau, which is so interesting, is that it is, in many, many respects, a world place. And a world place can be the little tiny spot on the tablecloth or the whole run of concentric circles which spring out. And when you go into a broader concentric circle, you realise the importance of the temple, because this is dedicated to Tin Hau. Now, the thing with the Tin Hau temple is you find them all around the Canton Delta. Hong Kong has 50-odd Tin Hau temples. But it's not actually a Cantonese deity, it's a Fukien deity. Now, of course, this is the thing, because when we look and think, why is the most widely worshipped deity in the Canton Delta originally from Fukien, it links us down to Canton and to Macau and the trade importance. Because in the 1540s and 1550s, as trade expanded, the best boat builders on the China coast came from Fukien. So they migrated down and they brought their goddess with them. So wherever you find Tin Hau temples, you'll find an original Fukien presence. So if you go to Penang, Singapore, Manila, Macau, Taiwan obviously, you'll find Tin Hau temple. So whenever I see this one and the others down there, it brings in Macau's regionality as well as its own inherent interests. So I quite like that. Another thing I've explored in this is I started geographically, so we go from the northern part of the city right down to the south. And the southern part is itself very interesting. This is Lowe. And the thing with Kolowan is it's still, if you know where you're looking, wooded, hilly, a little bit out of the way. This one I quite like because it's taken from just above Dr. P.J. Lobo's old house at Chukwan. And that, with the view in the right direction and a rare clear day without pollution, you can see that and think that's Macau 60 years ago still. Other things I explored. In my book, I wrote about what I wanted to write. And that's one of the fun things with writing independently. It's one of the nice things with having a freelance newspaper column, as you say whatever you like and write whatever you feel is appropriate, and if people are offended, then they are, and that's fine too. But what I wrote in my book were the things that I wanted. So there are things that I didn't include. So if you were to look in there for extensive lists of the casinos, wrong book, sorry. I wrote about funny things like because this little place has been there forever. And what I like about it is it's a window on an earlier time, because if you go into you can find the menu hasn't changed in 50 odd years. It has banana splits and Hawaiian sundaes and all these kinds of things that people had in the day when eating an ice cream was a bit of an adventure, and sitting in a pings up was something that was good, because most places didn't have air conditioning. So I just included that, and the staff are always lovely, and whenever I go in there they go, oh yeah. So it's always fun. Macau has village areas too, because it's easy enough to think it's city, but it's also village, and this is taken down at Baja, at the southern tip of the peninsula. Now, if you look at that, you'd think we could be in southern China, anywhere in southern China, right down to the walls and the plants and lunch waiting in front there. That was the second joke of the evening. That's the only other one. If we look at that, you'd think, now, how different is this from the rest of the Delta? Not greatly. And that's the other thing which is lovely with Macau, because it brings in so many other places regionally. But with looking at that, we can also bring in detail. Now that's one of the window tiles taken in that house, because I love that picture, and that was again one of Tony's, because if you look at it, to my mind, it encapsulates the overlayering, and that's the thing with Macau. There's layer upon layer upon layer upon layer just waiting to be peeled back, and that's what I've tried to do. It's an incredibly rich place. The other thing is the regionality, because these are some window shutters. Now we go over to Macau and you see window shutters everywhere. Now window shutters were commonplace in most places, Hong Kong until not that long ago, simply because of an absence of air conditioning, or it wasn't invented, and the need to take in ventilation. But the thing with these is they also bring in regionality, because if you look at the material above and below, that's pearl shells, mother of pearl shells. And that was a major import item from the Philippine Islands up into the Canton Delta. And that brings in regional trade links, because if you go into the cities around the Delta and the older houses, you'll find that all in the shutters. And the reason that pearl shell was used, before window glass, it enabled translucency. So you're getting light coming through, and it was also cheaper than glass. So there's a couple of places that use that, and I've included this one in it. The distempering on the wall, you see the red? The thing with this is, again, when we go to Macau, we see all these pastel painted colours, and you see the greens and the yellows and the pinks and so on, and we all think how beautiful it is, but we forget the practicality of paint, because today we see paint as being decorative. Originally it was preservative, because you need to preserve the wood or you need to preserve the stone. So if something is whitewash, lime wash, it kills the insects. If it was mixed in the pale yellows, which we see in many of the colonial cities, the French used a lot of it, it's because you've got sulphur in the whitewash. And the sulphur is an insecticide, so it keeps out the bugs. In the Brazilian colonial cities, it tended to be pinks and reds because they mixed in ox blood with the whitewash, because that was iron rich and that killed the bugs. So all of these colorants that we find, the blues and greens that you can find, they're often copper salts as well, again to kill the bugs or to kill the mold. So when we look at these things, we today think, oh, how pretty it is. It was originally practical, very, very practical. So I include that one because it's a rare example. Now it's obviously a chemical distemper of where they used ox blood in the paint. Then we get into the obvious. Everyone who goes over to Macau has seen Sao Paulo. But the thing with this is everyone has seen it, no one really knows too much about it. Because the thing with this, firstly, the tourist myth, and that's the ruins of the Cathedral of Macau. Everyone's all been told that, right? First thing, it was never the Cathedral of Macau. Never. What? No, it was not. What that building was constructed for was a collegiate church for the Jesuit seminary. The cathedral in Macau is where the cathedral in Macau has always been, down in the middle of town. So first myth busted. The thing with that, people also assume that it had something to do with Europe and China. No, it was everything to do with China and Japan, because the Portuguese presence on the China coast was as an entrepot and as a trading entity between China and Japan. At the time when the Japanese couldn't come to China because they were the Vikings of the Far East, they'd made themselves very unwelcome. They didn't come. At the time when the Ming prohibitions on external trade meant the Chinese weren't going out, it was a bit of a problem, because the Chinese and Japanese each had something that the other wanted, but they weren't talking. So in come the Portuguese, who can trade and work with the both. So it was very convenient. But the thing with this is wherever the Portuguese went in the world, they took their priests with them. And this is itself very interesting, because when they were going up to Japan, and they were very involved in Japan from Macau from the 1550s up until 1640, they had a very significant Catholic presence there, and they were training their priests in Macau to send up to Japan. So this was the church for the seminary there. And again, if we look at this, you'll see the big stone facade, which everyone has seen. That actually is a window on the collapse of the Japan trade, because wherever the Portuguese went, they took their priests. They had a lot of success in many places. They had so much success in Japan that it was the seed of their failure. What do I mean by that? Because the Japanese were very outward looking at this point in time. Southeast Asia was full of Japan towns, Lihomachi as they were called. So Ayutthaya, Manila, all of these places had large Japanese communities who were sending up intelligence to the Tokugawa, saying, of course, watch out for these priests because they're going to take over everything else. So gradually what started to happen is from the 1590s, the Tokugawa became alarmed at the rise of the Catholic presence, reasonably enough, and started to clamp down on them. So large numbers came down as refugees to Macau, and the church put them to work as refugee relief. And the building of that was actually done by Japanese refugees. So it's again one of these things where the high point of the Japan trade in Macau was actually the beginning of the sunset for them. So whenever I look at that, to my mind, it's nothing to do with Catholicism, really, and everything to do with regional trade in my own mind. Likewise, everyone sees the facade, they don't see the corner, and on the corner is the foundation stone for it in 1602. A very loose translation of that is the Holy Virgin Mother by the people of Macau built this in that year. And it's interesting because the mixed race creolized community in Macau, the Macaista as they're sometimes called, this particular community that evolved there, the first mothers and fathers of it were Japanese. The Macau dialect, the oldest words in it are Japanese. It's very, very interesting. The next wave of refugees that came up to Macau were after the Dutch capture of Malacca in 1641, and they came up in large numbers and settled in Macau. So actually the mixed race community in Macau are not European Chinese mixtures. It was actually European Japanese, Malaccan, all stirred together. And if you look at the old family photographs from this community, up until the early 20th century, they all look Filipino, in the sense of Malay with a bit of something else in there too. And the home cuisine is very Southeast Asian. Macau home cooking owes a lot more to Southeast Asia than it does to China. It's very, very interesting with that. And I just wanted to mention that little aspect. Then, of course, if we walk around in the middle of town, you find buildings which we've all seen. Now, the Empty Tong there has been on that site since the 1560s. It was originally set up to look after widows and orphans and deserving poor. It manages quite a number of charities. But I wanted to mention that because the building, like many things in Macau, one can multi-layer. You go into the centre of Macau and you see all these old buildings and think, oh, how wonderful it all is. Most of Macau dates from 1875 onwards. Why? Because in the September of 1874, the city was flattened by a massive typhoon. There were 5,000 people killed in the afternoon. Wiped out. So when you find a building which might have a date on it of, let's say, 1637, that would actually be something standing there. What you actually find today is mostly post-1875. And the architectural model for Macau after 1874-75 was actually Calcutta, because that was a major external trading partner. So it's quite interesting with this. But that building, it's right in the middle of town. You can photograph it, but you could also go up inside because it has some interesting artifacts within it. One of them is some links to the first bishop of Macau, because there's an oil portrait of him. There's a little museum upstairs. There's an oil portrait of him, but if you were to look closer, underneath it, there's a skull, because when he was exhumed, in a very Catholic way, they kept his skull, and they kept his crucifix, and they kept his rosary from his coffin, and that's all there, so you can go and see it. So it's one of those things where you go in and you see, oh, there's a skull. How interesting. There's also this oil portrait. Now the oil portrait is also in the chamber upstairs. That's of a lady called Martha Meerup. And Martha Meerup has a very lovely story behind her. She was originally a Muay Thai, and she'd been sold off, as Muay Thai were, and passed on from one person to another, as Muay Thai could be. But the person she ended up with finally was the number 2 of the East India Company in Macau. And he formed a genuine relationship with her, and when he died, he left her all his money. So she went from being a Muay Thai to being a very, very wealthy lady indeed. She owned ships and she owned a variety of things, and when she died, she left all her money to the Santa Casa. So there's a portrait of her there. But I mention that because that particular oil painting was used as the colour frontispiece for Austin Coates' lovely novel City of Broken Promises, which is quite a lovely fictionalised account of Martha Meerup's life. And it's a very, very good book actually, because a lot of Austin's research on Macau drew from the work of Jack Braga, who was a very prominent local scholar here. And Jack Braga could research it, Austin could write it. So this is what was done. Braga did the work and Austin wrote the novel. And it's well worth reading if you haven't read it. It's a lovely window on time and place. And that's the cover. Macau regionally brings us into technology transfer because Macau had the first lighthouse on the China coast, modern Western style lighthouse, and this is the one up at Gia. So if you go up there today you can see it, and it still flashes out at night, rather dwarfed by all of the casino lights just down below, but if you know where you're looking you can still see it flashing. And it was extremely important to people during the war in Hong Kong, because Macau's only 40 miles away and you could actually see that flashing in the distance. And there were people over here who looked and thought, in the distance you can see that, and there's a place which is unoccupied, as it turned. If you go up there you can see other links to other places, because Macau was a major exporter in the 16th century and early 17th of armaments and technology to Japan. And there were foundries in Macau that produced firearms and cannons and church bells. Wonderful connection, isn't it, when you actually think of it? This is one of the bells up at Gia, which was cast for the Japan export trade. In fact, if you go to Japan, there's a festival held at Tanegashima every 10 years called the Teppo Festival, which commemorates the introduction of firearms into Japan. And it's interesting with this because in 1991, and this is when they have their festival, it's every 10 years. In 1991, Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore happened to be on a visit to Japan, and the Teppo Festival was being held. And of course, Harry Lee can say these things. He said, of course, commemorating the introduction of firearms into Japan is a bit like celebrating giving liqueur chocolates to an alcoholic. He can get away with that. But if you go around in Macau, you can find these links to 17th century armature. If we look around in the middle of town, we can see all the pastel painted buildings, and some of them are new and some of them are old. But within the pastel paint, one of the aspects I tried to bring in my book, and that is the dark side. Because the thing with Macau, we can look at the beauty and think, oh, how wonderful it all is, how lovely, how much better the past must have been. We tell ourselves always that the past is a better place when quite often it isn't and wasn't. This brings it to my mind because this church here, Santo Agostini, was rebuilt after the 1874 typhoon. So from outside you think all very beautiful and all very lovely. But that was the church in Macau of the Novos Cristãos. And Novos Cristãos is the new Christians. That is to say, the converts to Catholicism. And they're actually very much a sort of number two category. One of the Portuguese myths has long been that the Portuguese didn't have a racial tendency. They weren't like the British or the French or the Dutch. Everything was all quite mellow and they all married in and it was all very friendly. And the historical evidence of this was rather different. And if we were to go into this church, you get a flavour of it. The flavour comes from a gravestone in the centre, because it's in the church. This grave, multi-layered, tells a broader story. It's of a girl called Maria de Moura. And the thing with her background story, if I can just explain this, is after Macau was closed to the Japan trade in 1641, the place collapsed economically because it only revolved around the Japan trade. So when that entrepot role was cut off, it had nothing else going. So for about 120 years, it was a very poor place with people living on past glory. So you had people who called themselves the Fidalgos, the son of a somebody. My grandfather was this, my great uncle was that. Yeah, well, who are you, kind of thing. But this is the thing. There were nevertheless some families in Macau that had money, and one was a family called de Moura. And the daughter of the family was an orphan, very rich little girl, and there were two men that fought a duel to marry her. And one of them was successful in the duel. He subsequently married her. And this is her gravestone, because the duel was fought when she was 9. She died in childbirth when she was 11. All under the rights of the church, so that's okay. The thing with this, though, is the gravestone records that there are the bones of Maria de Moura and her daughter Inês and the right arm of her husband, because he lost his arm in the course of the duel, so that's buried with her. But the other thing with this, which is interesting, is the surnames, because the thing with the Portuguese and Spanish, and the crowns were united at this time, and this is when Ferdinand and Isabella were kicking out the Jews and kicking out the Muslims, is that Spain and Portugal completely destroyed themselves by kicking out these two communities. Effectively what they did is, if you couldn't leave or wouldn't leave, you were forcibly converted to Catholicism and you had to take a surname which reflected this. So de Moura, of the Moors, gives you an idea that you're of originally Muslim background. There are also surnames which were given, which were to the Jews, which were of animals. And the reason they gave them animal names is, of course, this was the historical name for the killers of Christ, lower than animals. So what they would do is give them surnames of animals, and the animals were animals that they couldn't eat for their own religion. So one common one was Coelho. Antonio Coelho. Coelho's a rabbit. They couldn't eat them. Lighthouse was another one. Sucking pig. Couldn't eat that. Lagosta, lobster, another one. Now, of course, these people would get away from pogroms in Spain and Portugal, because every so often, of course, there'd be a religious issue with them. Oh, there they are. You can wonderful, isn't it? You could immediately tell who they were because if that's their surname, oh, get after them. So, of course, they'd had enough. So many of them eventually left. And if you were to go to Goa, Malacca, Portuguese world further east, you'll find these are quite common surnames of people that got away from Catholic bigotry. So it's quite a common and interesting thing there, and of course in that particular church you'll find these names because that was the church for that particular community. So as I say, it's one of the things which you can overlay and you see the broader world and the evil religious bigotry which comes in, which spread of course to Macau too. Another thing is in the northern part of the city, there's this building, and that's the Kassam Convent Orphanage. Now, the Kassam nuns set themselves up in Macau as they did in Hong Kong, and here, of course, Sing Sum became one of Hong Kong's best girls' schools, but it also had a large orphanage. The orphanage in Macau is still there, and their records indicate that between 1871, when they opened up, and 1934, which is the last record I looked at, they took in 1,200 boys and 34,000 girls. 34,000 girls. So you get an idea from that, just the Chinese attitude to females in particular, because these were overwhelmingly Chinese females that ended up in there, abandoned children and so on. But that brings me into something else. The thing with the Macau creolized community, I touched on before how the earlier generation were either Japanese or Malaccan connection. The Chinese admixture into the community came much later. And these were when you had people, usually at a lower socioeconomic level, who wanted or needed to get one of their sons married off. They couldn't afford a dowry, so they'd go off to the convent. And they'd say to the priest or the nun, right, well, young Antonio's running around the town, we need to find someone. Well, there's Maria, or there's Celestina, or there's Cecilia. And she's a good cook, and she's a good seamstress, and she's an undisputed virgin, and she's very obedient because we've caned her every day since she was born. So, of course, take your pick, that one, that one, that one. So, of course, they would then marry in. And I mention this because the Chinese admixture into this community you can track with names too, because these are all converted names. So names like Rosario, Rosary, Conceição, Conception, Ascension, Assumption, Cruz. Cruz is the interesting one, that's cross. So if you have a Portuguese surname Cruz, it indicates actually that it was the priest's housekeeper's child of the cross. It's quite an interesting thing when you actually look at that. But the Chinese admixture into that community in many cases came in through the nuns. It's fascinating, it's absolutely fascinating. But it brings in something else, and that is that within the Portuguese community in Hong Kong, you can find people who will say, oh, we don't have any Chinese ancestors. And you think, well, were they born in a house without a mirror? You know, where did they think their face came from? But actually, culturally, they've got a point, because these kids were brought up in the convents, totally deracinated, and didn't have a Chinese background in their milieu. The other thing with Macau is the pastel painted beauty. This is a lovely building down on the inner harbour. People would look at that and think, oh, how nice. It was one of the opium go-downs. The thing with Macau is economically it did everything that no one else would do, and it still does. It's one of the money laundering capitals of the world. It's one of the great white slaving places in the planet still. Drug trading, entrepot, you name it, they do it. And that's very, very much the way Macau has always been, because it's a little tiny place that survives by doing what other people don't necessarily are able to do. And I mention this because it's too easy from today's view to look back and say how wonderful it must have been. It was a place of slaves, it was a place of brothels, drug trading, all these other things, often hidden behind a pastel painted shade. Now, slaving I mentioned. Macau was an epicenter of what was called the coolie trade, and this was the export of labourers in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, because Chinese immigrants going into the other parts of the world, if they went out through Hong Kong, there was reasonable labour protection. If they went out through Macau, they'd go anywhere. So the thing with this is you'd have people illiterate, desperately poor, who'd be told some story up in the Hung Ha that, oh, go down to Macau and you'll actually be going down to work in Malaya or Borneo. They got down to Macau and eventually ended up going to Cuba or going to Peru or somewhere like that. Whoops, okay. Did I do something wrong? I probably did. That's better. Thank you, sir. I mention this because that is one of the coolie barracoons. There were barracks in Macau where they were kept, where they were tricked, where they were forced to sign things they couldn't even read, and then ended up off into the wider world. And the Macau slave trade was an international disgrace in the 1880s and 1890s. Likewise, in Macau, there were the Portuguese garrisons from all over the world. This is a bronze plate outside the fort at Mont, and it was put up there for the education and benefit of the Africans, because Macau had a large African garrison into the 1960s. And there are photographs there of very short, very dark, very black, red hats like this from Angola or Mozambique. And this says, halt attention, record for an instant the beautiful history of your country. Enter with your head high as a soldier of your country. Well, all right, okay. But that was very much a thing with Macau at that time, was the Africa connection. And if you go over to Macau today, the restaurants all have African chicken. And of course people think, and that's a traditional Macau dish. No. The households never cooked it. It was a restaurant dish, and it was introduced from Mozambique in the early 1950s. Thing that's always worth bearing in mind, tradition evolves very, very, very quickly in this part of the world. But I mentioned that connection. Another connection. This is a grave in the Parsi cemetery of a chap called Sir Jamsetji Gigi Boy. Isn't that a lovely name? Now, he was the Jardines cotton broker, and he was a very, very prominent merchant in Bombay. And if you go to Bombay today, there's a Sir J.J. this and a Sir J.J. that, and the Sir J.J. College of Art was actually what recruited Rudyard Kipling's father to go to India. So there's a whole broader connection there, but he died on one of his trips to Macau and is buried in the Parsi cemetery there, and is buried under this bilingual gravestone. And there's a wonderful Chinnery portrait of Sir J.J. in the Jardines boardroom down in town, but it's quite extraordinary. It's one of the curiosities, because Macau early on was very, very multi-ethnic. There were Armenians, there were Parsis, there were Sephardic Jews, there were Japanese, there were all sorts of things within a very, within a very, very small, very, very tiny place. So the diversity just shines through. One of the churches of San Lorenzo has, of course, photographs of various individuals, not photographs, stained glass. This chap, memorialised here, Pedro Nolasco da Silva, is a very, very interesting Macau figure from the late 19th century who, to use the investment banking term, arbitraged on Macau's advantages to Hong Kong, in that he was a great publisher of newspapers, and if he had a hate-on with someone in Macau, he'd publish a newspaper in Hong Kong to avoid the libel issues. So when he finally worked out his hatred, he closed the newspaper and then opened another one. There were dozens of Portuguese newspapers opened in Hong Kong in the late 19th century, and he was largely responsible for that. So there's a bit of connection between the two. His sons were very involved in business, and they built beautiful houses on the lower slopes of Gia. And this one is it was one of his son's houses. It's now the the building for the Monetary Authority. The one next door to it is the Lingnam College, which was his brother's house. But I mention that because Macau in the 1910s and 20s had the money to build places like this. And like so much in Macau, you don't ask too many questions. What were they doing to get the money for that at that point in time? In the same way today, when you look at people over there and think exactly what were they doing to get what they got. quite beautiful. Gia was known at that time as Macau's Riviera, because it had houses like this and gardens full of palms and oleanders, and very similar to the south of France. And as Somerset Maugham described to the south of France, it was a place in the sun for shady people. And Macau was like that too. The place in the sun, this little pavilion in the middle of town, is not a temple, it's a reading room. And the thing with that is it's a link to Macau's Cold War importance, because that was paid for and endowed by Ho Yin. And Ho Yin was, of course, one of the leading figures of South China in his lifetime. These patriotic businessmen get nothing like the credit or attention they should have, because what he did is he endowed this reading room, and it was full of newspapers and periodicals and magazines from right across the Chinese diaspora. It opens up at night, and it would have newspapers from Malaya and Singapore and Taiwan and Hong Kong and the mainland and all over, and people would be able to sit there and read what the others were thinking. And not only could you read what the others were thinking, but you could talk to this one and talk to that one and so on. So it was a great place for the China watchers at that time to go. And I mention that because Macau in the 1950s evolved into a new role. For a little tiny place, it played an enormous role in China's development at that point in time. At least in part because the people who were very, very involved in the economics there were the red capitalists. Ho Yin was one. Another one, which of course doesn't get anything like the credit which he should have, was Fok King Tong from Hong Kong. Because these people were the ones who were using Macau as a conduit for getting things in to the country at that time. Now, what were they doing? What were they getting in? China had no oil industry until 1956. There was the United Nations embargo pushed by the Americans in 1950. So what had they got? In 1950, they got a UN embargo, the Korean War. New government comes in, the country had had the Japanese, they'd had civil war, it was flattened, and Chiang Kai-shek, as a parting gesture, took the gold. So it was all gone. Anything that they needed to get in, they got in through Macau. And what they were getting in, as they had no oil industry, was diesel. And this was done through the Hong Kong fishing industry. Because as the fishing boats here mechanised, and they had diesel engines, they still had sails. So they would pump up full of diesel in Aberdeen, chug, 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 go out, up go the sails, sail over to Macau, pump it out on the inner harbour, go back out to the fishing banks, come back into Hong Kong 2 days later, no diesel, plenty of fish. Oh, we've been out at sea for 3 days. That was all Fok. It's very, very interesting because he was doing the same thing in the 1940s, counterbalancing the Japanese with kerosene. So if it worked against the Japs, it worked against the Americans. Very, very nice. And you had these people who were doing that all through that time. And you look and think, loyal, 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 all through those times, 50s, 60s, into the 70s, 1980s, you get economic liberalisation. And what happens with these people? They get anything they want. You want to open a hotel? It's yours. You want a port? It's yours. Grandson wants an Olympic high diver? Anyone you want. I'm being joking. But nevertheless, it's a thing we don't quite recognise as just the importance of these people at that time. And I mention it because they just don't get enough credit for what they were doing. This brings into something else, because Macau, from the 1950s, was very, very socialist. They blew in the way the wind required them to blow. So you had guilds, this being the carpenters' guilds. The guilds turn into a kungwoi, because of course these things were just a natural evolution on with it. Why do you find there's so very limited anti-government sentiment in Macau? At least in part because these kungwoi have been controlling things very well, but also they put in money, they put in resources, they're quite good at assisting. So they've done a lot of worthwhile things. Other businesses, the banks in Macau all grew out of the pawn shops, and over there today you can still see a couple of the pawnbrokers' shops. This one, Dak Seng, was a very, very big one, and that was controlled by two very interesting men. One was Fu Tak Yam, and the other was Ko Ho-Neng. And these were two of the leading figures in Macau business in the middle part of the century. So that one there is still there. Of course, the thing with the pawnbrokers' tower is that was where it'd store the things which you'd put into Dong. This building up in the northern part of the city is now used for the Pui Ching School, but that was owned by the Lowe family, and they were very involved in the early gambling concessions. That's a thing worth mentioning, because today we go over to Macau and you see all the gambling, We tend to think today it's all relatively new. The gambling concession as a monopoly was Daiheng in 1922, and they had it on a 40-year concession until 1962, when Fock and Stanley Ho and Teddy Yip and their guys took it on with SGDM for another 40 years, and then it liberalised. But the consortium that was involved early on was the Lowe family, Futakyam, as I mentioned, Gohoneng, and a few others, and they consolidated it. And with that consolidation, the economic takeoff in Macau in the 20s and 30s happened, because they had to put in for reservoir construction and harbour dredging and lots of other things. So they got a lot out of it, but they also put a lot back. Another connection over there is Sun Yat-sen. Now, Sun Yat-sen practiced for a while as a medical doctor in Macau, and this is at the Gengwu Hospital. The building, of course, has long since been replaced, but he was there for a time. I mention this because Macau tends to play up the Sun Yat-sen connections, some of which are very tenuous. The university plays up a Sun Yat-sen connection too. They like to pretend that he was a graduate, but he wasn't. He wasn't. He really wasn't. It was the College of Medicine. It was before. It wasn't this. He only came to Hong Kong U once, in which he gave a lecture saying that everything he learned about being a revolutionary he learned in Hong Kong. So it's a little bit there. But the thing with Macau, though, is it was where his wife lived. Now, this is the house where Lowe Mo Cheng went to live after he divorced her, because he had a wife, and the wife had the sons, and Dr. Sun Fo was one of them. He got rid of the older wife to marry Sung Ching Ling, and he married Sung Ching Ling because she was young and pretty and her father was rich. Father was rich, certainly helped. So Lowe Mo Cheng went down to Macau, and she lived there till she died in 1952 in that house. But if you go in there today, you'll find it's got pictures of the great man dressed up in a sort of strange uniform with a feather duster on his head. Looks like a Gamoso up there, doesn't it? But the thing with this is, if you go into the building, it mentions him. It doesn't mention much about her. And the thing I mention with this, though, is whenever I go in there, and I've taken young friends in there who've gone, ooh, and they've found it, it has a very unpleasant feeling in the building, because you go in and you get a sense of, get out! It's like there's an evil ghost in there or something. I'm not particularly susceptible to places, but you go in and it doesn't feel comfortable. It really doesn't. Clearly, because there's an angry woman who's in there, who's been very fed up and so on. I just mentioned, next time you go over there, go in the building. I've suggested this, so you'll probably feel it. And then there are other buildings further out at Taipa. These were the government quarters out on the waterfront, and these are quite lovely, and they now contain house museums. They're quite lovely, and they give an idealised view of what much of Macau looked like before. This is the old dairy up in the northern part of the city, and that was used as a hygienic dairy for the better milking of cattle. It's now used as an arts depot. And this is a link to Hong Kong, interestingly, because that's the manager's bungalow in ruins of the Green Island Cement Company. And Green Island Cement was originally a Macau company that was bought over by Shu and Tomes in the 20s and moved over to Hong Kong. So it's a curious thing there. Green Island Cement is, of course, now very much a Hong Kong company. It was originally a Macau one. The buildings over there, we can find a lot of buildings which are interwar, because Macau had a period of prosperity in the 20s and 30s, so they're built in styles from that time. So what you find over there are buildings that are in deco styles, art moderne, Bauhaus, often in a very good state of repair. And I mention that because so often we see the tropical Baroque and we forget the interwar. And this one I quite like, because it's like the prow of a ship. I would look at that and it reminds me of the Queen Mary or something like that. This one's the old Hotel Kwok Chai down on the inner harbour, which when I first went over to Macau I was tempted to stay in, but it was so full of prostitutes, so I thought maybe not. Not my thing, not at 2 o'clock in the morning. But it's now been thoroughly gutted out, and it's due to be extensively renovated. But you can see there the interwar architectural detail. Likewise, this is a theatre up in the northern part of the city. Now the Alegria again goes back to the 1930s, quite typical of its time. And that's the lovely thing with Backstreet Macau. Know what you're looking at. They've still got all of these things. This is a bit of Art Deco detailing on Skyline, which is a home up at Penna. It was originally owned by a chap called Freddie Gallion, who ran the Macau Electric, and the house is absolutely gorgeous, and it's still original deco inside and out, that skyline there. I've always greatly coveted that house. Macau brings us into other connections, because this is the Morrison Chapel. Now that's in the East India Company cemetery. And the thing with that little tiny chapel, it's a link to Hong Kong during the war and a link to the widening role of women. Because you look at that and think, little tiny chapel, what's a connection with it? Macau during the war was surrounded but not occupied. Portuguese neutrality was largely left alone. And there was a large Anglican community in Macau which didn't have a vicar. Now that was of concern to Bishop Hall, the Anglican Bishop of Hong Kong, who was actually in China at that time, because they didn't have a clergyman. Now they couldn't get any European mail because of the blockade. They didn't have a suitable Chinese mail to get in either. So Bishop Hall made the rather revolutionary change and said, well, we'll have a woman. So the first ever female clergywoman with the Anglican Church was actually a Chinese lady called Florence Lee, who was ordained for Macau. And she kept her license after the war. So it's one of these interesting things where both Hong Kong and Macau come together in terms of social change, because quite a lot of religious groups these days have female clergy. They actually find it quite easier to get them than men, but of course it takes someone, in this case the Bishop of Hong Kong, turning and saying, why not? And that was Macau then. It was very interesting. I must mention Bishop Hall, because in the 1940s and 50s he was known in Hong Kong as the Pink Bishop. And the reason for that is he was very, very socialist. He'd been a personal friend of Zhou Enlai since the 1920s. And in the 40s and early 50s was backing and forthing between Hong Kong and the mainland. The reason he was backing and forthing so much is he was the Attlee Labour government's man in Hong Kong, if you will, because he was trusted by all sides, up and down and up and down and up and down. And it's one of these fascinating things where you'd think, someone like that, hidden in plain sight, the Anglican Bishop of Hong Kong was the main kind of go-between. Very, very, very interesting. And I mentioned that one because there's so much about Macau, Hong Kong and the region that just spreads out. This is the East India Company cemetery just down below it, and this is where the story of my own interest in this starts to coalesce, because I used to go in there quite regularly when I was first going to Macau and didn't really know much about it, and gradually came to know more. And always loved it. It's a sort of open-air archive and quite attractive and beautiful. These are gravestones let into the wall there below it, and these actually predate the cemetery. But the story of the renovation of this links down to the former Vice-Chancellor at Hong Kong U and his very energetic widow May, because they started to go over there in the 50s and were very involved in the restoration of this cemetery, and the fact that you can see the state of it being as it is there was largely their work. They got very involved in this and got onto the Hong Kong Bank and made them do some work as trustees and so forth, and it's really quite beautiful and is a legacy of what they did. That's a view looking out over the reservoir. The thing with that is the reservoir system was built in the 1920s, and until the reservoir system was built there was no town water supply in Macau, so economic takeoff only came much later. That's a view looking out over the bridges down there below. Macau during the war, I mentioned, that's a prayer to the Virgin of Fatima put up in 1943 in the cathedral, and it says, "Queen of the world, Mother of Portugal, help Macau." Now, of course, the Japanese were backing off by 1943 anyway, but it's a link to Macau during the war. Another thing with Macau during the war, and this is where the Hong Kong connection comes in. Hong Kong was occupied, as we all know. Large numbers of refugees went over to Macau, where they were kept and supported there by the British consul and by various other organisations. But this is the hockey club on the Campo, the big field in the middle of town. Now, in 1944, there was a fundraising match raised on the Campo, a hockey match, to raise money for the refugees, and there was a Macau team and a Hong Kong team, and actually had this from someone who was in the audience and heard it. The Hong Kong team had been provided with jerseys with a big R on them, and the R was refugiado, refugee. And the governor of Macau, Gabriel Teixeira, came down to open this, and the two teams were formed up, home team, away team, and he described this. He said, R? What's the R? Well, Your Excellency, that's refugiado, refugee. Oh, no. They stopped the game insisted on new jerseys being found. They had to go sort of find new things for them. He said, we cannot have that. These are not refugees. These are our guests. Isn't that nice? That was very, very much the attitude. You know, you don't treat people like this. And of course, in today's world where refugees are so often outsourced as a nuisance, it's a thing that needs to be remembered. A leading figure in Macau during the war, and this brings down to the personal side of this, was Dr. P.J. Lowe. Now, Dr. Lowe is a very, very interesting man, originally from Timor, who was taken up by, it was a mixed Portuguese, Chinese, not quite sure what descent, taken up by a Portuguese doctor who provided for his education. He ended up with a doctorate in economics from Coimbra. He came out to Macau as the Government Director of Economic Services and then was very, very involved in many areas of activity. During the war, he personally paid for hundreds of people out of his own pocket. He was the owner of the Macau radio station, Radio Villa Verge, among other enterprises. Here he is conducting his own orchestra. He is a very keen musician. But the thing with him is that he assisted quite a number of people, and this is where the story comes on down toward me with this book and my own interests. Because when I was working on this in 97, 99, I came to know these paintings. Now, the background to this, I knew May Ride very well. She was very, very good to me when I was a lot younger. And in 96, not long before she went to live in England, I was out having dinner with her. She was living in Repulse Bay. And she said, you've got to have the stones, you must have the stones. Well, what stones are these, May? She and Lindsay had been working on the story of the Protestant cemetery, and that was subsequently published in the mid-90s as an East India Company cemetery, Protestant burials in Macau, and Bunny Mellor did that. But the other side of it was the Portuguese stones and statues, and they got very agitated and said, you must have all of this. Oh, okay, I must have it. So anyway, I took away all of these boxes and bales of papers, which then took up the next 2 years of my life, and they actually formed the bulk of the Lindsay Ride collection in here. But in the course of this, when I was working on it, and back and forth over there a lot, I came upon these paintings. And these were wonderful paintings done in Macau during the war, and we ended up using one of them as the frontispiece for the book. And they were done by a white Russian refugee artist called George Smirnov. And Smirnov had gone across to Macau with his family in 1944, and Dr. Lowe had actually paid for the family's cost of living in order for him to live and do these things. And he painted 60-odd portraits of what Macau looked like at that time. And they're absolutely beautiful because they're full of light and colour, and they're very, very lovely things, and an extremely good record of it. So I became very interested in those paintings. And through the interest in the paintings, I came to know more about the artist, because he was born in Vladivostok in 1903 and moved to Harbin in Manchuria with his mother when he was a teenager, trained as an architect there, married, family were there. They then went down to Qingdao. He had quite a good architectural practice there. Then they were chased out of there by the Japs. They ended up down in Hong Kong in 1939 with nothing, living in a fisherman's hut in Cheung Chau for a while. Then he re-established himself. He designed the yacht club in Causeway Bay. And then the war supervened. They were white Russians, so they were nobody's responsibility. So they weren't interned, they weren't looked after, nothing. In 1944, the house was bombed out by the Americans, so they again had nothing. And he went across with his older daughter to Macau, and the wife and younger daughter and son came across on the next ferry, the wife giving up her wedding ring, the only thing she had left, to pay for the ticket going over. So they arrived in Macau literally with nothing, and they ended up living in this courtyard house at Patio de Seis Casas. And that was where they lived during the war, and the paintings were done in the upstairs room in there. They were in another one briefly, but most of the time in this one. So the building is still there. But through the course of all of this interest, and that's the house where those paintings were done, still there today, and it's actually now being restored. We've given enough cause to that. But that's the mother and the two daughters. Now, through the interest in this, I became friends with the daughters. And Irene, the older daughter, wrote the foreword for my book. And Nina, the younger one, lives out in Repulse Bay. So it's one of these things where the stories all come together. That was on their voyage down from Qingdao. That was about the only decent clothes they had left by that point in time after they were getting away from the Japanese. But the introduction that Nina wrote was quite lovely. not Irene, I mean to say, describing how wonderful the people of Macau were to them, how they had food on the table every day, and how they've always been very grateful to the place. And the house that I showed there before, once I was over in Macau with Irene, it was quite wonderful. We're up at the church of San Lorenzo, which is just up the hill from there, and she said, let's see if we can do what I did as a kid, because children, of course, playing their games and doing things. She said, I was there with her husband, you hold one hand, I hold the other, and I'm going to count the steps back to the house, because they used to do that, as kids would do. So we did that, and we sort of walked and down, all the while Paul, her husband, and I looking at all this. We got down, and we ended up at the door of the house. It was extraordinary. I'm just the way a childhood memory can play in with it. But Irene wrote the foreword, and Dr. Lobo's son, Sir Roger, again known for years, he wrote the back jacket endorsement. So it's all of the way these personal stories come through with it. It's quite marvellous. Another thing I think I must mention with Dr. Lobo, it was through him that word came into Hong Kong about the British surrender, the Japanese surrender, I mean to say. Because Macau being surrounded but not occupied, they had word came in, word was got to the British consul that they needed to re-establish themselves here, and the imprisoned CS, Attorney General and Chief Justice had to be informed. They needed to get a note signed by the consul. That was sent over to Hong Kong from Macau with Sir Roger, as he is now, carrying the note. And he's now 92. Quite amazing. I remember once asking him, I said, weren't you worried about that coming across at that point in time? Oh, no, we had the pirates helping us. Because, of course, the pirates were very anti-Japanese. They hated them. Were the pirates armed? Oh, yes, they were armed. Sten guns all around, like that. Where did they get the Sten guns from? Oh, some of my father's contacts. But it's a thing worth understanding and mentioning. Through all of this, it's been rather a personal story, which took an hour instead of 45 minutes. I hope everyone found this of some interest. No one ran away anyway, that is always a good sign. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you. Thanks, Jason. The first thing that struck me when I saw the book and held it in my hands, and you pointed out, it is really quite a magnum opus. 25 years of research, 6 years of writing. When did you know to stop?
Well, the thing with this, it had been one of those projects which was a bit kind of on and off and on and off. And I would have liked actually to have had another couple of months on it. At least in part, the reason I accelerated to get this out in the summer is Tony Headley, who did the photographs, was very unwell at that time, extremely unwell. So the thought was, get it done, time's now, get it out. So there was a personal motivation for that. I would have ideally had another couple of months because there are minor things. I'm 95% happy with it. And I think most authors would get to a book where they think if you're more than 90% happy with what you've got, you're there. So I'm 90 to 95%. Another couple of months would have been there. But there's also the issue of publishable length. Because the thing with Macau is it's so rich, you can just keep on going. So where do I start? Where do you stop? So yes, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have a question? I have a quick question.
Oh, go on.
Think, where are the Smirnoff paintings now?
Right, the Smirnoff paintings are in the Museum of Art collection in Macau, and a few individuals got some of them as well. So the Lobos have, I think, half a dozen of them. The Dalmata family have got 3 or 4. There's a couple of other people who have got them. But the thing with the pictures, I might just mention, they're not on public display because they're so fragile, so they only get taken out from time to time, but they've been extensively reproduced. But the thing with them is they're all that big. They're only one size. And they're only one size because Macau being surrounded, they couldn't get supplies in. So that was the only size painting book they had. Likewise, the paints, there are a few colours that aren't actually included in them because it was one of the Jesuit priests who was one of their friends who gave them a box of paints to use, and there were some paints they didn't have. So there are certain colours that aren't in them. They're quite extraordinary. But the thing with them is I think the most beautiful pictures because they're full of light and colour, and they're very, very peaceful, and they're an inner world of someone whose life was actually very unhappy, who never really had any peace in his life. And the thing with these is I've got a full set of the reproductions which I have up and down the stairs in my house, and they're beautiful things. They really are lovely, and the day doesn't pass that I don't take that thing on board. Yeah, because Irene mentioned in her forward that the time that they had in Macau, that 18 months when they were surrounded by war and they had nothing at all, was the only period in her father's life when he was actually at peace with himself. And it really comes out in the paintings.
Terrific. So we have some time for questions. Please wait for the microphone. Just raise your hand.
There are no questions. Well, I've come all the way from the New Territories to have no questions. This is Paul. Joke.
No questions? Would you like to ask a question of the audience?
Yes, I would. I'd like to ask a question of why there are no questions.
Yes, we have a question. Of course we have a question.
What really initially drew you to Macau? I mean, was it for, as we know, people going to Macau looking for a good time, or, have a break from Hong Kong? So what did that sort of historical interest, or was that the first step that sort of drew you into Macau?
Well, not really, because I'd always been interested in history since I was a kid. And Macau was one of those places that had been on my mental radar as one of those days I will go, one of those days I will visit. So it was a natural thing with it, and I was beguiled with it right from the very beginning. Also, at that point in time, it was very different from my everyday life. And a change and so on. So it was different from what life was. And as time went on, I became more and more drawn into it. Yeah. I think because I was interested in and attracted by the unconventional aspect of it. And in particular, I used to find I'd say to colleagues, I've just come home from the weekend in Macau, and they'd also automatically assume that it had been gambling and whores and God knows what. No, none of that. What were you doing? Well, churches and temples and archives. Oh, there's none of that in Macau. It's only casinos, tell the truth. No, it was really, that's what I was going for. I just became more and more fascinated. And then as I became more interested in the formal study of Hong Kong, which I did here, you of course can't know Hong Kong without understanding Macau. And then through that, I was in an interesting position in my early 20s in that I got, I suppose, taken up by a run of quite older people. So Austin Coates, who I mentioned there before, May Ride, various others, quite a number of people from the Hong Kong Portuguese community I came to know. So they all said, oh, he's interested, you talk to him. So it was an interesting thing that in my early mid-20s I was hanging out with people in their 60s, 70s, 80s. And didn't feel any strangeness in that, still don't. I like people as I like them. So yeah, I kind of got fielded into that world. Yeah, and then of course reading Austin's books and so on. He's one of the joint dedicatees of the book, Austin, George Smirnoff through the paintings, and then of course dear old May. I don't know if that answered the question.
Yes, please.
Dr. McCrae.
Oh, thanks. This is a great talk. I'm just wondering, why not include, not that I'm a big fan of it, but why not include some more about the casinos, even in a critical light?
Right. Well, the thing is, I brought in with some of this a bit on the development of the casino industry, so the Daiheng monopoly and then STDM and how it all evolved, because so often people don't realise that it actually grew out as a response to the economic pressure from Hong Kong. The fact that they had to find some means of earning a living, and that was part of it. I deliberately didn't go into the new aspect, at least in part because it changes so quickly. So it's almost out of date, firstly. Secondly, I didn't want to turn out something that was guidebooky. And one of the problems or shortcomings with those two earlier books which I've got out there is they were actually collected journalism from the Morning Post column. So there was something which have done extremely well, much to my surprise, because they're actually not very good books. I shouldn't say that because then no one will buy them. But the thing with that was that they were actually sort of more guidebooky, so I definitely didn't want to have something like that. And then there's the other aspect, and that is the thing with much of the contemporary gaming industry there, it's tacky, tawdry, derivative, ugly, built entirely to suck the money out of people who really don't have enough taste or brains to know that they're being leached upon. You look at the new modern ones and it's just picked up from the Nevada desert and dumped down in Macau. So I thought there was no point in that sense being overly rude about it, wasting space upon it. And one thing I have learned is Hong Kong's a small place, Macau's a small place, so not really too much to put in there, but also how clever would that be? So a whole run of things. I just the short answer to that, I guess, is I didn't see the point. Yeah. Other questions?
Yes, please.
Thank you for the talk. How do you think Macau is doing in preserving its heritages and recording the history possibly compared to Hong Kong?
Well, this is where it gets interesting, and I've been asked similar questions to that before. The thing with heritage conservation, architectural conservation and so on is, firstly, in Macau there's much more to preserve in the first place. It goes back centuries. Hong Kong as an urban artefact is 170 years old with a significant amount of change in the last 50. So there's not that much here, firstly. Secondly, much of Macau has been preserved as a result of periods of economic decline. Poverty is a great preserver. So when we see in Hong Kong the fact that there isn't anything very old, it's because it's been a success. So it's actually a victim of success in that way, if you want to look at it like that. The other thing is, with any kind of conservation initiative, who pays for it? Now this is the other thing, because in Macau, with the gambling liberalisation in recent years, they've got a lot more money. So with the World Heritage listing for the core, you then got a transitional area and then a free fall area. That out there pays for that in there. So the thing is, if you didn't have that, you wouldn't have that. And when we look over at what Macau was like even when I first started going there 25 or so years ago, it's infinitely better in some ways. The other thing with it, though, is World Heritage listings often are the great destructors of urban centres, in that the buildings are wonderfully kept, but everything else goes. So instead of having interesting little shops, you've got tacky souvenir things that you find anywhere else. So you see that. There's also more money for documentation. So there's been a lot more books written, a lot more studies done, which of course enables more research. But of course the problem with that, and it's the same thing as you find in Hong Kong with an academic industry, which sometimes gets a bit beyond itself, after a while there's just more and more and more and more and more and more and more about less and less and less and less. And that's the thing that I'm increasingly finding with much about Macau. How much more can you really write that's really original? And it's the same thing with much Hong Kong study. After a while, how much more can you say about some really little tiny thing? Well, of course, in academia, people just go, they mine it down to the centre of the world and end up coming out on the other side. Another thing, of course, with Macau is that they are much more anchored in terms of who they are, and they've been much more able to recognise that. One of the things which has driven a lot of heritage awareness, history awareness in Hong Kong, certainly in the last 10 years, has been a reaction to increasing mainlandisation. So what you do find, and that's where it's interesting, it's not so much a thing about Hong Kong, it's just, we're this, because we're not that. And this is the thing, it's so much of it is driven by, and we're not that. Whereas in Macau, they're much more aware of their place in the world. And certainly in the last half century or so, have always been very accepting of the fact that actually they're in China. A question I've been asked when I've given this lecture on a number of occasions, and I drew great gasps when this was one some months ago, what implications does Macau today have for Hong Kong future? The comment I always make, and this is again one of the problems with studying history properly, is it does give you a little bit of a vantage point into the future. Macau today is Hong Kong in 5 years. In terms of the way it's run, the way it's administered, the relationship to the mainland, all of that. If not 5 years, certainly within 10. And anyone who thinks that it's not has just got rocks in their head. absolute rocks in the head. That's just the trajectory. That's the way it's moving. Now, I'm not saying right or wrong. That's just the trend. In 10 years' time, tell me I'm wrong.
We'll invite you back at that time.
Thank you for the talk. Actually, the Macau Tourism Board have quite generously subsidizing the Hong Kong students to travel to Macau. Now they are almost, I think, $300 for each student going down there. As a teacher, that I have a chance to take a student over there. Primary students, what we suggested, the first step to know about Macau, from the history or the relation with Macau to Hong Kong or wherever. What's the first step that is the best way to introduce Macau to this, like 10, 12 years old students?
At that level, I would go with the internationalization. And the thing is, in the core area, if you go to Sao Paulo and to the forts nearby, those locations, you can multi-layer it because you're bringing in religion, technology transfer, China, Japan, Europe, China. There's the number of things that you can peel back from just that immediate area are quite profound. Yeah. And of course, you mentioned there the fact that the tourism board in Macau subsidise Hong Kong students. Now, of course, this is absolutely fantastic. You wouldn't find that coming from the Hong Kong Tourist Board, would you? Because it's run by idiots and cretins from the Liberal Party. But the simple fact with this is, over there, they recognise that they've got something. Here, oh, we only want them in the shops. I mean, this is just, you know. Every time I go over to Macau, and I find this increasingly when I go up to Canton, which I do very frequently, the people in public life there, particularly in the sort of heritage world, and you compare them with the same people in Hong Kong, I'm sorry, the Hong Kong counterparts are in the gutter. They're not even mediocre. Not even mediocre by comparison with them, because the sense of vision in places like Macau. The idea being, if you're subsidising students to come, it's an investment in the future, isn't it? Because they're going to love it and they're going to keep coming back. And they're going to go home and say, Mummy, I want to go to Macau again. Right? Hello? I mean, it's just brains. You know, anyway. If a little bit of anger comes through there, it's because I look at the Hong Kong counterpart and you just think with so many things here, it is missed opportunity after missed opportunity. Anyway, enough of that.
Next question. Any other questions? Yes, we have at the back.
Two questions. So one is, when did the use of the Portuguese language start waning in Macau? And another is, when did you become such a good storyteller?
Right. Well, the use of the Portuguese language. Now, the thing with Macau, and it's interesting with Portuguese, it's the language of the courts still. So it hasn't really waned in that sense. If anything, it has improved in recent years. And part of that has been a recognition, again, on the part of the mainland. They recognise that they're part of China. China has a big resource-driven presence in West Africa, East Africa and Brazil. They all speak Portuguese. So if you want to go to Mozambique, Angola, Brazil, learn Portuguese. So it's not a useless language, it's actually a very useful one. So people in Macau have recognised that they can arbitrage that. So there's been an interest in learning Portuguese there. So it hasn't declined, it's kind of gone up in that sense. And you don't really see it on a social connection. English tends to be the language of tourism. The other thing, of course, with Macau is that the Portuguese there, much of which was a very creolised population, they recognised where they lived. So they all speak Cantonese, as any sensible person does when 80% of the population do too. It's where people like me tend to be regarded as strange, because people say, well, why do you speak that? And I said, because it's where I live. But the thing is, in Macau, that's how they've always been. So you'll find people who look very Portuguese who suddenly straight into Chinese, because that's what they speak with their friends. So no, it hasn't declined. And what was the second question?
How did you become such a good storyteller?
Good God. I don't know, really. I don't own a television. So I tend to, yes, well, because if you own a television, it's all receptive, isn't it? Whereas I tend to have friends who come and we talk, and I was brought up in a household where I was told to talk, and if I wasn't talked, I was made to talk. I think also, I've never really thought of an answer to this one, but also, as I touched on before, I also, when I was younger, had a lot of very older friends. And this is of a generation who spoke, who talked, who read. So because I was like that, I tended to fit in a lot more with rather older people. So if you're sitting there talking to May Ride and Austin Coates and people like that, I wouldn't have been invited twice if I was boring, I suppose. You know? I've never really thought about that one. Thank you. I take that as a compliment, and thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more question, and it's at the back. Thank you.
Hi, this is not a question. I'm just proud to say that I'm a Filia de Macau.
Wonderful. And which family are you from?
It's the Gutierrez Alonso.
Okay. Right. Okay.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, but again, you see, this is the whole thing, which makes the whole FM story so very, very. Filia Macau is the son of Macau or the daughter of Macau. The thing with that is the whole diasporic movement of this group, the Creolized families from Macau who came over to Hong Kong, who went up to Shanghai, who went to other places, and then went over to other parts of the world. It's interesting because you find there's now actually a larger group of this community in places like California than there are on the China coast. It's a funny thing actually that they say that there are actually more Macanese living in the San Francisco Bay Area than there are in Hong Kong and Macau combined. But the diasporic movement is really interesting because what you found is you had effectively a home culture which people thought would die out, particularly with immigration. And in the 1950s and 60s, when large numbers of these people went particularly to the United States, the first generation of them all wanted to be Americans. But then the next generation decided that actually they wanted to know why they looked like they looked like, why they spoke in certain ways, why they ate certain things at certain times, and in a way they reacted against what the broader culture thought. Because if you went to live in, say, San Diego in 1960, and you had a surname like Gazano or Rodriguez or Gutierrez or something like this, and you look faintly Hispanic looking, people assume you're a Mexican. So the pushback was, no, we're not a Mexican. Where are you from? Oh, we're from Hong Kong. Oh, but you're not Chan or Wong or Fung. Well, no, but so they're kind of defining themselves against what other people see them as being. So they've had to think a bit more about who they are and what their identity is. And that then got reflected in food and language and culture and so on. Then the third generation, they write the family genealogies and compile the recipe books and do the photo albums and all these interesting things, which means it doesn't die. And which means that people who are outside that community can draw a lot of benefit from it. And I say benefit because the food is superb, very fattening.
Okay, with that, I think we're going to have to end because he has an early start tomorrow.
Oh, I know. Don't worry about an early start for me.
I'm sure he will. Jason will stay behind and sign copies of his books.
I definitely will. I want them all signed because I don't want to carry them away.
So it's been really fascinating. We've learned a great deal. I'm sure. I know I have, and I'm sure everybody else has. A few myths have been exploded. It's been wonderful. So please join me in thanking Jason.
Thank you.
We have a very small souvenir. It's a replica that we had digitised and recreated, reproduced. It's the first Hong Kong Almanac from 1846. Woo-hoo. It's not exactly bedtime reading, but as an historian, I think you can appreciate its contents. It might be bedtime
reading for me. You don't know what I read at night.
So there you go.
Thank you very much.
And before you leave, I'll just remind you, our next book talk is a very special one again. It'll be 2 weeks from tonight, the 13th of November. It's History and Popular Memory, The Power of Story in Moments of Crisis by Paul Cohen. So please come to that. Thank you. Last word?
I'm still plugged in.
The final word.
The final word is thank you all very much. I do hope this was of some interest, and it's very kind to be told I'm a nice raconteur. That's made my night. Thank you. Thank you.